Good day, my beautiful children. Wonderful to be with you again. Today is Wednesday, April the 29th, almost May. Pretty excited. Getting closer to summer. Today we're going to start talking or continue our talk on the Cold War and uh, talk mainly about the Korean War, which is really kind of a forgotten war, at least here in the United States, mostly because we got our butts handed to us. We don't talk usually about the ones we lost. Um, but we'll get into that in a minute. All right. So the Cold War, right? The Cold War was called a Cold War because, for the most part, there wasn't a ton of actual fighting, at least between the Soviet Union and the United States. They never directly fought each other, but they are going to fight against each other in what are called proxy wars, which we'll define and get into later. Um, the Korean War. Let's talk about it. So the World War II ends in 1950 or 45, 1945, and and we're going to be in another war uh, before even 10 years are out. So let's talk about that. First thing we're going to say is something happens in China after World War II, and after the Japanese are defeated and driven out of China. There's a communist revolution, and we're going to come back and do a whole side unit on the communist revolution in China. But basically, here's what you need to know: in China, most people were extremely poor peasants, and after the Japanese are defeated, it leaves this vacuum of power, and the communists rise up and they seize control, and they turn China into a communist nation. So now you've got most of Asia at this point, or a huge chunk of Asia, at least land wise, is communist. You got the Soviet Union, which is communist, and you've got now China, which is communist. And the United States and our allies were deathly afraid that you were going to just see communist revolutions in country after country after country following World War II. They were afraid of what was something that was called domino effect, and the idea is just like you set up dominoes and you hit one and they topple over the next couple. That's what they were afraid of. That once the Soviet Union went communist and China went communist, eventually they thought other countries were going to turn communist. Our president at the time was still Harry Truman. This is Truman took over after FDR died in office and was there through the end of the World War II, and he was president after World War II. And Truman came up with a plan called the Truman Doctrine. So Truman Doctrine is pretty simple. The idea is, okay, we get it. Communism exists already in the Soviet Union and now in China. What's done is done. The horses are out of the barn in those countries, but we are going to stop it from popping up in any new countries. That's called a policy of containment. If it already exists, fine. There's nothing we can do about it. We're not going to go into those countries and fight them to make them give up communism, but we will fight in other countries to make sure that they don't become communists. So that's Truman Doctrine: policy of containment. Keep communism where it already exists and don't let it spread. So that doctrine, that plan, Truman Doctrine, and the policy of containment is going to get us involved in two major wars during the Cold War. So the first one is in Korea. So Korea, if you don't know, if you look at this map, it's hard to see, but China is directly to the north, and Japan would be off the coast over here. And Korea had been occupied by the Japanese before World War II, and after World War II, and the Japanese were driven out, it left this vacuum of power. So what ends up happening is China, which is just to the north of Korea, of the Korean Peninsula, they back a communist revolution in the north, and the communists from the north invade the south. So what's going to end up happening is Korea at that time was then divided along the 38th parallel, the 38th line of latitude. And if we're going to really get into this, and by the way, Korean War, 1950 to 1953, very short. So, long story short, communist forces in the north, backed by China, are going to invade democratic South Korea who is going to be backed by the United Nations, including the United States. And at the beginning of this, uh, if we were in class, I have another lesson where it has a map of this and it kind of follows the ebb and flow. So you see the green up here is the communist North, and the pink down here is a democratic South. And at the beginning of the war, in the first couple months, the North turns almost the entire peninsula green, and then eventually the U.S. jumps in with UN forces, and they drive the North up, so it becomes almost all pink again. And then China jumps in and drives the pink back to the 38th parallel again, and that's how it goes. Uh, so, a couple things about this. Number one, um, it, it technically is not a war. Did people die? Yeah. Millions of people died. Tens of thousands of Americans died. But it was not a war because only Congress can declare war. We have not officially been in a war since 1941. That's the last time that Congress declared war, when we declared war on Germany and Japan. So Vietnam, technically not a war. Korea, technically not a war. What do they call it? They call it a police action, or a conflict. But those are just semantics. Those are just words. People died. It's a war. So that's why the United States can say technically we've never lost a war, because we didn't officially declare war. Um, so this war is largely forgotten. Again, one, because in the United States we don't talk about it much because we didn't win. Nobody really won. It ends in a stalemate. Um, North Korea and South Korea are still separate to this day. They are still divided along the 38th parallel. Nothing changes in these 3 years of fighting. Nothing changes. And there are some interesting stories that go along with the Korean War, but at the end of the day, you have all these, millions of people dying, and for what? Nothing. North Korea and South Korea remain divided to this day, and technically, this war is still going on. They've never officially signed a treaty to end this thing, so it's the longest running war in modern history. Um, anyway, a couple of stories that come out of this. The commander in chief of the UN force was a guy named General MacArthur, who was very famous for what he did in World War II. He was the man in charge of the Philippines and the Pacific Theater for the United States, and he's a war hero. And he was put in charge of the UN forces, and he argued with President Eisenhower, who's the president at the time, about how to handle the war. And MacArthur publicly, um, you know, argued with MacArthur, or with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower fired him. Just said, "You're done. Get out." Um, so that's one of the stories. Um, don't really care about the election of '52, other than Dwight Eisenhower, who was another war hero. He was the Allied commander of the Normandy, the D-Day invasion in World War II. Um, he became president. So anyway, 1953, the country gets divided at the 38th parallel, which is exactly how it was before the war even started. We have 54,000 Americans dead, and more than 1.5 million Koreans and Chinese that were killed. So this was very costly, and still to this day, um, is a cause of conflict in that area. The North Koreans and the South Koreans hate each other. If you've ever read about the demilitarized zone on the 38th parallel, it's one of the most tense places on the world, on the planet. Um, you go there today, and there's this little strip of concrete that divides these two countries. And on one side are North Koreans with guns, and on the other side are South Koreans with guns, and also American and UN forces are stationed there. And it's still very tense. Um, North Korea to this day remains communist, and they're a very oppressive regime. Kim Jong Un is the president there, and I don't know if you guys have been paying attention in the news, but there are rumors now that Kim Jong Un is ill, or has been hurt in some way. I've read that he had a surgery that went wrong. I've read that maybe he was wounded or injured in a accident at a missile silo. No one knows, because they don't. North Korea, they don't let the press talk about things. Nobody knows what's actually going. It's a very mysterious place. So we're waiting to hear if he's alive or well, or what is going on. Um, all right, so that's the Korean War. Uh, so a couple other things about fighting communism. There's this term brinkmanship, And what brinkmanship is it's a fancy way of saying basically it's a peeing contest. You have two sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, both trying to act like the biggest, baddest man on the planet, and basically taunting each other right up to the point of war, but not going over the line. So both sides did this. It was like a very dangerous chess match, trying to like push each other right to the edge. We had at that time what was called a doomsday clock, which is it was a fake clock, but it was the idea that if you got a clock face, the hands of the clock were um, midnight was nuclear Armageddon. We're going to have a nuclear war, and everybody's going to die. And the closer the hands got to midnight, the closer we were to nuclear war. And there were a few times when those hands of the clock were at like 11:59:59. We'll talk about some of them, but like the Cuban Missile Crisis would be one. The U-2 incident would be one. Um, so both sides were guilty of trying to push the other side just to try and make them look, their enemies look bad, or make themselves look good. Um, Eisenhower, President Eisenhower at the time, uh, created the Central Intelligence Agency, which was basically our spy agency to spy on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, had the KGB, and both sides would spy on each other on the regular. And we also have uprisings in Eastern Europe against the Soviet regimes there, which we'll get to later on. And this will be the last thing to talk about, the U2 incident. So you guys maybe know the name U2 because they're an Irish rock band that is really awesome. But the U2 incident, you know what? I'm going to hold off on that till tomorrow because I want to talk about that in a lot more detail, and I'm running out of time today. Um, but this is an incident where that brought us closer to nuclear war with the Soviet Union that we'll get into tomorrow. So that's it for today. Uh, peace, you guys. Peace and love. Miss you guys, and I will catch up with you guys tomorrow.